This week, we're going to talk about the annual sales meeting, which is a tradition with many companies and a useful thing.
I've always enjoyed going to these. I don't know that there's really an annual meeting that I haven't enjoyed attending. I've always had a good time, whether it's been productive and efficient use of funds for the company. I've never really worried about that too much. So
until it was your company.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Yeah. It's always a party, and who doesn't want to go to a party? Why should companies have an annual sales meeting?
You mentioned the tradition, and I think this is a tradition that goes back a long ways, right? Think back before people had email and mobile phones and things were largely done on paper. The origin of this is you really needed to bring your team together, and there was no other way to do it. And that evolved over the years, I think, right? And it got fancier. The locations got more entertaining. And I think there's many companies of a certain size that have always had one. Why would you disrupt that? But I do think it's worth asking the question, is this meeting still serving our needs in the best way possible? Are we getting the most out of it? Like, we're having everybody show up for 3 or 4 days. Could we be doing more with that time, or could we be doing better things with that time?
You mean like 3 or 4 more days worth of selling stuff?
Right. Yeah, that's an opportunity cost. And think about January, right? January in life sciences for me has always been a pretty busy month because you have new budget energy coming from customers, and you have post-holiday energy coming from the sales and marketing teams, and that a lot of people that had put off doing things at the end of the previous year are now doing things in January, and you're taking yourself out of the field for 4 days.
Yeah, and you see a lot of people that on the buying side that have been holding off on purchases through the fourth quarter, sometimes even back into the third quarter. So they got stuff they've been wanting since September, but they haven't had the budget. And now they've got all this money burning a hole in their pocket, and you're partying instead of out there selling to them. So why not just do it all with Zoom calls?
Well,
a lot cheaper.
I mean, the people that organize these things are usually deeply invested in the in-person experience generally, like themselves. And so there's a strong desire to do that in person. And I think there is a lot of the intangible benefit of bringing people together as a group and letting discussions happen freely in a way that you just can't replicate on Zoom. That has not gone away, and that has not changed. How much of that do you need, and how much of that should be unstructured, and how much should be structured interaction? Those are, I think, more of the nuances that make a successful meeting versus an unsuccessful meeting.
Right. But they're definitely expensive. If you start to add up the cost, not just the opportunity cost of not being out in the field making sales, but you're still paying those salaries that are not productive. You've got the travel cost, the hotel cost, the entertainment and food cost, and usually some costs associated with just organizing the event as well, because you often want to use an outside party to help with that if you're going to be effective. These things can easily run $50,000, $100,000 just in direct cost, or even more. I've certainly have seen them even more.
I was at one that cost over $1 million.
Yeah. At one point I was running an 18-person sales team, and we pulled them all in, and it was pricey, and we did it for a week. Yeah. So you want to make sure that you're actually doing stuff that can only be done face-to-face, that is going to justify that cost to the business, and is going to hopefully, significantly return you something for that investment. Because it's, at the end of the day, sales exist because they put more money in the bank than they take out of the bank for their cost. And if sales is costing you more than they're bringing in revenue, you don't really have a sales team anymore. You just have a money sink.
Right. The intangibles, though, it's hard to calculate a return in dollars, I think, on a annual sales meeting. Like, off the top of my head, I've struggled to figure out a way to do that, because a lot of those, you mentioned the partying, right? That is something that sales reps of a certain tenure have come to expect. And if you yank that away, it's going to be noticed. I'm not saying
right.
I'm not saying it's efficient, but it's one of those things that, because of its tradition, it's hard. It can be hard to eliminate that part of it.
Yeah, and I think that's something that companies have to consider, because there's an enormous difference between that top 10% or 15% of sales reps and that bottom 50% in terms of their performance. So you don't want to do things that are going to drive away the best performers. And there are certain, you're right, there are certain things that are almost tradition. The annual sales meeting is one, having spiffs, having President's Club. There's a number of these things that don't really exist in a similar form anywhere else in the company, but are things that salespeople expect as perks to the job and perks to the effort that they're out there making. And you pull those away, and you're definitely going to have a negative effect, at least in certain quarters. And that's something to consider. And at the same time, again, I think that a lot of this is valuable. The ability, especially the ability to have senior salespeople that have a lot of experience under their belt, being able to interact with the junior salespeople and be able to just talk about the stories of deals that worked and deals that didn't work, and things they did to close a sale and things they did to lose a sale. So enormous amount of knowledge transfer that can occur between the senior high performers and the younger people that are still learning and still coming up.
Yeah. And that's something you want to maximize to the extent possible. And I think there's different session formats that you can do that will help maximize that. So part of that is a show and tell. Part of it could be a team problem solving exercise. But where I think a lot of meetings go off the rails is on the first morning, the CEO runs up on stage and maybe there's like a band or some music or something like that. And he and a couple other executives will give some energizing talks, and everybody's got the right mood set. Everybody's properly caffeinated. And then you commence several hundred PowerPoint slides over the next few days. And that whatever energy gain you picked up in the first 30 to 60 minutes, you're going to just erode away with each additional slide.
Right. And I think the thing that's important to think about is that there are certain things that are relatively easy to do in a face-to-face environment that is really difficult to accomplish in a remote environment. And for instance, the kind of one-on-one conversations and trading of stories and building relationships, especially between senior reps and the younger junior reps, is vital. And there's no webinar or Zoom format where any of that will ever occur. And that happens, and that doesn't happen in the middle of the PowerPoint decks either. That happens at the bar, at the pool, depending on the type of company and the generation, on the golf course. There's still a few people that do that, I think. Yep. And it's very powerful to have those relationships at the lower level so that you've got a more autonomous team, that if somebody has a problem, they're not coming back up to management for a solution. They've got peers they can reach out to that they trust. That if they see something, they don't have to run it through the channels to make sure that someone in the company goes after the opportunity. They can make a direct connection to a peer. And so you end up with a much more manageable team and a much more autonomous team and a much more productive team by having those peer level relationships and that peer level trust built, so that they don't need you as the manager to coordinate everything. Now, again, there are certain types of managers that, like that world where they control everything, but that's not going to be an effective company. It's not going to be an effective process.
Right. Yeah. And so I think I once, some of the comments we've made so far have been, create a picture in my mind of some of the larger companies I've worked at where there is like a stage and you're in a big hotel ballroom and things like that. But one of my positions, I was a member of a 6-person sales team that covered the globe. And we would get together for a meeting as part of the larger company. But most of the stuff we did was on our own. It wasn't really attached to the larger company. And so our rooms or our sessions would have 15 people in them. And for a couple of those meetings, they brought in a professional facilitator to basically help plan the meeting and help execute the sessions. And she was extremely good at keeping things on agenda, picking up on issues that came up that we might want to adjust the agenda to address later on, being able to make the sessions more interactive rather than just simply a one-way dumping of information. And I think a consultant, when you think about all the money that you're spending on this, spending $3,000 to $10,000 on a consultant, if you're a small group, is going to make a big difference.
Yeah. Going back to why do them face-to-face instead of remote. That also brings the question is there are certain activities, some of which are traditional with sales meetings, that probably don't need to occur because you can make those things happen perfectly well in a remote way with the current era. And there are things like product training. Maybe the exception would be if you really need extensive hands-on training on a complex instrument and you've got the engineers there to show you how. That would be an example. But most product training doesn't look like that.
No.
And so just drop a PowerPoint deck in the email or in the Dropbox or in the Slack channel, and you're going to be able to let people do that on their own. There's one of the other things that I've seen that is just cringy is when HR insists on getting involved. This is usually bigger companies. HR insists on getting involved, and they insist on doing these absurd bonding activities that could not be a bigger waste of time. If you want a bonding activity, have an open bar, have a day at the pool. You're not going to get bonding from bonding activities. This is, again, one of the poor inventions of HR.
I'll slight disagree with that.
Okay.
So I think the types of activities that you're thinking of, I can picture exactly what those are. And I would agree with you that they're low value. I think there are some activities you could put in a category like that actually would be effective, but it's going to be very different than what your HR events have looked like historically. We can cover that another time. Like applying, and honestly, after having a full morning of PowerPoint slides, I wouldn't mind a hokey HR activity just to give my brain a rest.
Or maybe just don't do the full morning of PowerPoint slides.
Yeah, that's really easily avoidable. And I think there's these things, because of tradition, take on a momentum of their own. When you're in the planning phases for this, you have the marketing department involved, and people are already mentally putting slide decks together. And it's just because it's been done that way for so long, it's going to keep being done that way until somebody wakes up and says, maybe there's something else. And so I think at a minimum, these decks should be any slide deck, it should be prepared in advance and reviewed in light of what's the objective that we want to accomplish when we're spending this money and we have these people in the room. Is the slide deck accomplishing that activity or that objective or not? I think that's one powerful thing to consider. Another one is going to be, you got to ask yourself the question, could you deliver this a different way? And would your session be different if everybody had a copy of the slides 2 weeks in advance? So the purpose of doing the meeting is not to have everybody see slides for the first time and memorize them or take notes like that. There are better other formats for information delivery than that. What we really want is interaction.
Right. And the other thing, this is much broader than sales meetings, but you generally want to avoid presentations that are what I call reading for the blind slide decks, where you basically throw up a slide and read what's on it as though no one else in the audience can. So you want to make the meeting streamlined. And probably a good rule of thumb is, do you really need more than 15 minutes for any given presentation? Probably not.
That's true of a lot of presentations, not just sales meetings, right?
But one of the other things I think is very important is getting the marketing team involved in a couple of different ways. So one is marketing's already got big ideas for the coming year. And so it's useful to, have some of these things that they're working on be exposed to the sales team. One, so the sales team knows what's coming, but two, so the sales team can stop really idiotic things from coming. Because one of the things that often happens, I would say often happens, is almost universal, is that there is a huge disconnect between the marketing team and the sales team. And one of the biggest disconnects is that, and I have seen this over and over again, entire marketing teams where no person in that team has ever actually seen a real live customer face to face in their natural habitat. It is a complete abstraction to them. And they end up with these just fantastical ideas of how the world works among their customer base. And the difference is the salespeople are the opposite. They are constantly engaged face to face with customers and prospects. So they've got a deep understanding of what's important to them, the language they use to talk about the product and the problem that you're trying to address, the competing things in their environment that can either support or draw attention away from the product you're trying to sell. how that product has to fit in with everything else that they're doing. And salespeople have much deeper understanding of this. Way too many marketing teams are just completely devoid of any of this lived experience. And the best solution is still to have a program where you get the marketing people out in front of customers on some regular basis. But a fallback is have the marketing team have some level of involvement and presence during the sales meeting so that they've got some exposure and so that the salespeople can hear what they're saying and maybe give them some corrections in terms of this is really how they talk about this, or no, that's not really an important thing for the people I'm talking to. Again, the opportunity to have a lot of peer level exchange that can result in fundamental differences in what happens going forward for the year within the company in a way that you're not going to be able to achieve this through a Zoom call.
Right. So I agree with you that there's a lot of marketers that don't have enough customer experience, right? And at some level, I think it's a salesperson's job to be the expert in the customer and the expert in their accounts. But so you're never going to have a marketer approach that level of knowledge just because it's not a core function of their job to know
Right.
that. The function of their job is to know the group and what the group trends are and the market. A shortcut to having some of these experiences, I think you can achieve that through role play. And everybody cringes when that word comes up, but we can call it something else. We can call it rehearsal. We can call it simulation. And if you do...
Sales cosplay?
Right, yes. And for a marketing...
Everyone gets a cape?
Yeah. So for a marketing person at the annual sales meeting, like it is, you do have oftentimes most of the marketing team there, you have most of the sales team there. And if you do some role play exercise, the marketing team can observe, they can participate, and you have to be doing enough of it for it to stop being embarrassing and special and just then start to focus on, okay, what are the dynamics of the one-to-one interaction that a salesperson from our company has with a customer? And you put the salesperson in the role of the customer, they can play that role pretty well because they've heard the objections, they've had the experiences. And then if you have the marketing person in the role of the customer, then they're going to receive that experience with a different set of eyes and ears than if it's something on a PowerPoint slide.
Right. A few other things I think that are useful to cover, although again, the decks should be distributed well ahead of time so that people can understand and ask questions. But generally, the new year is going to be a new fiscal year, and it's going to be a new set of objectives from upper management for the company in terms of both financial objectives, where they think the company is going, and where they want to potentially pivot the focus of the company in the market. These are very high-level strategic. This is CEO, CFO material. But I think this is a good opportunity to be able to communicate what these objectives are, what the shifts are, if there are going to be any for the coming year, so that the sales team is aligned with the strategic direction of the company. Because again, if that's not communicated, it's easy to have the sales team fall out of alignment and end up, not selling and putting the right emphasis necessarily on the right products or the right customers that senior leadership has decided is the correct direction of the company. Because again, a lot of senior leadership's job is to be looking over the edge of the horizon at what's the competitive landscape, especially in biotech, what are the technology shifts that are coming that are going to impact them? Is there some product on the horizon that you're going to smash into a brick wall? For instance, I remember back in the gene array days when next-gen sequencing came out. And so superficially, very different technologies, but next-gen sequencing tended to really eat a lot of the gene array business. And that's the responsibility of upper management. And it's the responsibility of the company to make sure that the sales team understands this and understands how they need to pivot to start to move things as they reach out into the market to avoid some of these traps coming.
And so the difference between the CEO writing a report about what the company performance was last year and what is expected this year is that the CEO has an opportunity to really express their feelings about it in a way that you can't do it in a written format, and also to defend to offer an opportunity for criticism and to defend that criticism. Most sales reps aren't going to do that, but you'll get managers in those big plenary sessions that will stand up and say, so we grew at 8% last year and you want us to grow at 50% this year. How do you think that's justified? Right? And you never want to set yourself up to fail that kind of question. But I think being able to give strong answers in that kind of environment, and for the CEO and CFO to demonstrate their knowledge of the dynamics of the company and their confidence in what's coming next, that's why the in-person format and the dynamic format is superior.
And I would add one other thing there too, is that jump in if you have a different view on this, but I think for the most part, most people in the company, including the sales team, don't really care what the P&L looks like last year or this year or next year. What they care about is I still have a paycheck and a job, and will the commission checks not bounce? Pretty much beyond that, there's not going to be a lot of deep interest in the financials. And a real eye glaze over moment is when the CFO gets up and spends an hour reviewing last year's P&L and balance sheet and the coming year's P&L and forecast. Because again, it's one of those things where nobody in the audience cares. You're wasting their time. You're far better off to step back and talk in more generalities around, is the company generally doing well? What are the plans to expand the company, pivot the company? What are you seeing in the market? So these very high level things that aren't getting down into the financial details, and that are going to be relevant and of interest to people on the team, because they care about the health of the company. They don't necessarily care about the details of the P&L.
Right. So I have a slightly different take on that, which is, so the simple one is, hey, if the company is generating billions in profit, why am I not getting a cost of living increase in my salary? So that's always the question. But
yeah, you can't blow the doors open for awkward questions there too.
Right. But if we want to expand on that, it's those types of presentations, like going through the P&L and other things that are high level like that, like it helps contextualize what your role is in the company. And so one of the positions I worked, we were a small division of a much larger company. There were really 3 divisions. And the biggest division, which had the majority of the sales representatives, grew. I remember sitting in this meeting, they grew at 1%. And for them, that was fantastic.
Right.
Because this was a division that owned the market pretty much for the products that they were selling. And it was a outsized contributor to top line revenue. And for them to maintain that market position was really their goal. Like, it's a totally different goal from what my little division was doing, where we have 5% of the available market and we're outgunned and undermanned by our competitors. But at the same time, the future profit growth of the company is going to come from the little division like mine. And it's our job to make that into something much bigger. And I think that helps, to me, that crystallized what my role and my team's role was in the bigger picture of things. And from that, I understood, okay, this is how the CEO feels about my team and my team's contribution.
Yeah. And one other thing that I think is important to do in the face-to-face environment is to present and review the compensation plan, because it typically changes from every year. And the reason that it's important to do this in a face-to-face environment and not in a Zoom call is because this is such an emotional thing for salespeople. It is the thing that drives them, and it's the thing they fear, and it's the thing that is going to make them feel like either a success or a failure. And so there's an enormous amount of emotional baggage around this. And it becomes really important that the sales team understand what the goals are, understand how the plan is going to work, so there's no surprises, and understand what they may need to do in their own approach at the individual level for the coming year that was different than what they did last year to be successful with the plan. Because those changes in the compensation plan are going to be driven by strategic changes in the business that may not be obvious to the salespeople. The sales meeting is the wrong place to present it. They should have a copy of this with some explanation, and probably even a Zoom call or two a month before the sales meeting. So they've got time to go through it, understand it, process it, and have meaningful questions. And so the goal is you really want everybody to A, understand it, and B, buy into it, not just accept it, but to buy into it, so that, because most of their behavior that you're trying to modify with the changes in the compensation plan is very individual behavior that has to be very voluntary. And if they don't fully understand it and they don't fully accept and buy into it, not necessarily like it, but accept it and buy into it, and you're not going to get the kind of behavioral changes that you're attempting to achieve with the changes that you've made in the compensation plan.
But you can also see the reaction in the room when you're discussing it. So that's pretty valuable to have that kind of rollout. You also have to have the goals. If you have individual goals established at that point, and not just the framework of the bonus or comp plan, but the goals that apply to each individual, if those individuals know what their goals are when they come into the meeting, it's going to be a more effective meeting for them in terms of figuring out, okay, I need to do certain activities this year, and I know I have certain weaknesses, and what can I do at this meeting to give me the best shot at making my individual goal? If you have the meeting and then you announce all that stuff afterwards, it's an opportunity is missed.
But again, I think an important part of management in general and sales management is understanding the personal emotional impacts of the changes that you're rolling out to the staff, because the business is doing things because it has to do things, because it's trying to, go after growth opportunities, avoid, impending competitive risk. So the company's having to pivot to be able to continue to grow and to continue to be successful. And so that's going to mean changes. And often those changes are disproportionately impacts the sales team, since they're really the point of the spear in terms of out there directly in front of the customer. And so it becomes important to understand what's the personal emotional impact of these changes, and to make sure that people know that you understand that and know that you're trying to acknowledge and address it and hear it. That's one of those things that is not easy to do on a Zoom call, that you really need that kind of intimate face-to-face environment to make that work occur correctly and smoothly and get the right outcomes.
That's a good way to summarize it.